السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. لعل البعض يهرم في 10 سنوات، بيد أننا في الميادين ازددنا خبرة ونضجا ووعيا وعمقا معرفيا وثقافيا. لعل برنامج من الداخل، هذا البرنامج الفريد بمقاربته والمتعدد اللغات، قطعا لأننا مع الإنسان في كل مكان، تمكن من تسهيل عبورنا ومن تمتين الروابط العالمية في كل الاتجاهات والاختصاصات والخبرات النوعية. في هذه الحلقة الأخيرة من برنامج من الداخل، تحية من القلب إلى قلب وعقل وروح كل متابع ومشاهد وصاحب رأي ومحب وسواهم، إلى كل من شاركنا آراءه وتعليقاته واقتراحاته. وكونوا على ثقة يقينا بأننا في الميادين نقرأ ونتابع كل ما يردنا. اعذرونا قد لا نتمكن من الرد أو التفاعل مع كل التعليقات، ولكن حروف كلماتكم لطالما وجدت سبيلا إلى قلوبنا ووجداننا وعقولنا. نعم، عندما تتعانق التقاليد والقيم تتمايز الشعوب، وحين يتحدث الفن لغة الثقافة ترتقي الأمم، وعندما تتفاعل السياسة مع الفكر نستمزج الآراء. من الداخل شكل إطلالة ورؤية عمقتا أواصر الثقافة وكشفتا المعلومات وشاركتا في الآراء والتحليلات الثاقبة لأكثر من 10 سنوات على شاشة الميادين، ونقلتاها إلى العالم. نعم، حين تمتزج الروح الراقية مع الكدح والمثابرة والبحث يكون التوفيق من الله. اسمحوا لنا بأن نطوي اليوم صفحة من الداخل، هذا البرنامج الذي ظل لأكثر من عقد من الزمن توقيعا ومحطة مميزة للميادين ولمتابعيها عالميا، ولي بالطبع. نختتم اليوم البرنامج مع ضيف مميز وعريق لطالما أغنى بحضوره ومعلوماته قناة الميادين بالرؤية والأفق الأوسع والعمق التحليلي. أهلا وسهلا بكم إلى ختام هذا البرنامج مع مؤسس ومدير منتدى النزاعات السيد ألستر كروك، الدبلوماسي البريطاني السابق الذي عمل في الاستخبارات البريطانية وفي دبلوماسية الاتحاد الأوروبي، حيث نستشرف بحلول عام 2023 أبرز التحديات الداهمة سياسيا واقتصاديا عالميا. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. Alistair Crook, founder and director of Conflicts Forum, former senior British diplomat and advisor on Middle East issues to the EU Foreign Policy Chief. Welcome to From the Inside Min al-Dakhil finale, Alistair.
Well, thank you very much, and I feel very honored to be on your finale program. Indeed, I do.
Pure pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Pure pleasure and honor to have you always, Alistair. Well, today, as we start 2023, and as we begin to see and watch the new world order take shape on the horizon, might you, sir, highlight the biggest challenges facing our world today?
Well, I'll put it in a slightly unusual way, perhaps. Most people talk about nuclear weapons, tactical bombs. I think the most dangerous thing that we're facing today is actually, and I don't mean this in an unpleasant way, but in the sense that the fragility of the American psyche. It can easily get disturbed. And I think what we are looking at in Ukraine, where it's quite possible that we will see escalation from the Americans and from NATO into Western Ukraine, either with or as a result of the Russia's offensive, which is coming when the ground is hard enough. I think, what Putin wants is to avoid the Americans suddenly having a 9/11 moment or some other emotional moment where they say, this is Pearl Harbor, oh my God, we've got to do something. And then they insert forces into Ukraine. These are ready, these forces. I mean, we don't know, it's not fixed. It's only an idea at the moment. But there are some, perhaps 200,000 Poles being mobilized. We could see a sort of 250,000 force put in ostensibly to save Ukraine from the Russian offensive that will be coming. And they will put those in and they will assume, and this is why it's so dangerous, they'll assume that Putin will hold up his hands and he say, oh my God, no, you know, I don't want to go head to head with the NATO forces. I mean, God knows where that goes. So, you know, I'll back off and let's sit down and have talks. I don't think it's going to work like that.
Yes.
I don't think there's any chance.
We all know, Alistair, that Russia is a tough nut to crack, a major land power, and the West is turning its head to the other side, not wanting to admit or read this reality. No way Ukraine can win. Russia, as you said, is preparing offensive. The question is, what will a West high on Russia failing and Putin must be pushed aside do?
Well, none of us know the answer to that. That is, I mean, the key question as we go, and this is why I said, you know, it depends. I mean, the narrative has become so dysfunctional in the West. I mean, every day you pick up in the Western papers and you read that Putin is hiding in a basement at the bottom of the Kremlin, that no one speaks to him, he's muttering to himself, he's giving orders, barking out orders to his generals that they don't pay any attention to, and that it's, you know, Mad Vlad is what they call him. And I mean that the Russian army is failing, it's being defeated in Afghanistan. I mean, it's got so hyped, and the people don't know the alternatives. They believe Russia is being defeated across the board and Ukraine is winning and will be taking back Crimea. And they believe also that somehow the Russian public is going to rise up and is against the war and is going to depose Putin. And then we'll all go back to a normal when they can have cheap gas and cheap oil again. Only it's a delusion, and it's not going to happen, and it's very dangerous because it is a delusion. And what happens when you put a pin in this bubble of delusion in the West? And that's why I said, you know, the psyche is the most important thing, not nuclear weapons. If that explodes in a bad way, in a different way, you know, this might take all of us. There might be escalation, major escalation, because I think the Russians will not hold back if NATO goes into Ukraine for whatever motives, to draw a line of peacekeeping as a NATO force. My understanding is and this is just an informal one, but is that Russia will probably engage them. And then what? And then, you know, I mean, the Americans will go nuts.
Yes.
The question is, after Kabul, after the debacle at Kabul, can they survive a debacle in Kiev and Ukraine?
Yes, there is a Western circle that understands this reality, Alistair. They know Putin is not vulnerable and is not weak. US President Joe Biden said to a questioner that NATO is fragile and Europeans do not want escalation. The EU and NATO might well fragment. Apparently, the West has few cards, weapons running short, money on edge, Ukraine manpower on edge. So no simple game changer option, right?
No, not quite as simple as that. I mean, I understand what you're saying, but you know, from 2008, the balance of power in Europe has moved to the east, to Poland and to Czech and the Baltic states. And they are they are, if you like, the tail wagging the Brussels dog now. And they have power. And so Scholz and Macron have very little ability because they sold out. They sold out in 2008, Mayadeen. They sold out in 2014. They sold out on the Minsk agreements. They're in a weak position. And the Poles and the others want a war with Russia. They are more fanatical than some of the sort of neocons in Washington. So there is if you like, an alliance, a nexus that can take place, which would advocate going for escalation and pushing it through, because the EU doesn't have the systems, doesn't have the structures to row back from the extraordinary situation that they painted themselves into, where they are going to suffer hugely from their mistaken decisions when they sanctioned Russia. But I don't see how they're going to push back from it. I don't really see how they're going to. And in the United States, what you say is quite true. There are voices. Mearsheimer, even Kissinger, he's not really a realist, but he's a sort of hawk realist. But I mean, they're pushing that way. But when you hear what Biden said about, the Christmas ceasefire, when he was talking about how Putin is, unleashing sort of weapons on kindergartens, on hospitals and schools during this holiday period, bombing them, killing civilians. I mean, it's not the language of a statesman. It's not the language of someone who has a grip on the situation. This is the sort of thing you expect, to hear down at a bar, but not from the White House. But so, the atmosphere is hard. And the question is, I mean, there's so much disparity between what you see in the Middle East and what a European or American reads in their newspaper, which is quite the opposite. I mean, to a ludicrous extent.
True. In this sense, Alistair, the West is hostage to its absurd narrative of Russia as paper tiger, despite the reality that it is NATO that has been revealed as weaker than expected. Why is this ridiculous narrative so important to the West?
Well, I think, it started off, it's a very interesting question, because I think it started off the narrative about, Russia's going to lose as a pure psyops operation, whereby they hope to convince the Russian public, that this was a failure and that they must turn against their own government and against Putin. And this was part of, traditional psyop. But then I think it's changed, because now we're in a situation where really the Western economy is literally at the cusp of an abyss. I mean, it's quite serious, because a 40-year era has come to an end. There's no more zero interest rates, zero inflation, and free money, and interest rates are going up, and things are volatile and shaking quite carefully. And so one of the reasons for this narrative about Russia's going to fail was simply to moderate expectations in the markets, to markets feel, don't worry, interest rates may not go up as much as you think, inflation may come down, because soon we'll be back. Putin will be gone, Russia will be crushed, and we'll step in and take whatever resources we need from Russia. And so I think they're using it to try and to keep, if you like, markets stable enough so that hopefully they hope that inflation itself will moderate and markets might stabilize and normality will return. I'm saying it in quite strong terms, but that's to give you the flavor of what's going on. The head of the Bank of America, Jamie Dimon, just recently in a talk said, listen, I'm going to have to amend my forecast for 2023. He said, in my last forecast, I said the year there would be stormy conditions. I want to change that. I want to say we're facing a hurricane conditions. That's how he described it.
It's even a tsunami, perhaps, Alistair, not just a hurricane.
Even a tsunami. And that's what the IMF lady said just this weekend. She said structural damage to the global economy is coming with this. I don't know.
And this might continue for the coming decade or even 20 years to come, as some have speculated.
I think you're talking about a long-term multi, because this is not one of these sort of annual trade cycles of credit squeezing. We're talking about the end of a meta cycle, 40 years of easy money. That's coming to an end. And the problem is that the system is not structurally any longer built for high interest. I mean, these aren't high, but at 5%, much of the economy goes underwater. And so you're already starting to see great worries. And why it's going to be different from the ordinary trade cycle is because for the first time we see the big commercial banks are getting worried about people being able to pay their loans back. So they're tightening hard.
Right.
And, that's the danger.
Right. Continuing inflation with high energy costs for the long term, as the prospect of a Russian collapse is exposed as nonsense. Markets might collapse. They are at the cusp, as you have explained. High inflation for longer can bring down the financial house of cards. So, to admit that a failure is inevitable, what might the West do? What are the options facing, say, a competitively challenged Europe?
Facing for Europe, it has few options. I think its economy is becoming uncompetitive with energy prices at the levels they are. Already some of the big companies are having to move to the United States, where energy is not as cheap as it used to be in Europe, but it's not that expensive. BASF, for example, the big German company, is moving much of its production. But other smaller companies are just going out of business. Unemployment is going to rise. What can the Europeans do about this? Only two things. One is they can try and protect their industry by putting high tariffs up, but that is going to contract the economy even more if they put big tariffs on to protect their industry from its lack of competitiveness, or they will try and subsidize it. Either way, whenever you start printing money, and I think they'll probably do both, either way, when you start to print money, everybody's going to lose.
Well, Noam Chomsky, one of the world's greatest public intellectuals, said recently, it's a truism that the world is in a dismal state. Indeed, there are too many great challenges facing our world, and the planet is in fact at a breaking point. What's less widely recognized is that another world is possible because the present one is simply not sustainable. Do you agree, Alistair?
Yeah, it's not in a dismal state. It's in a state of change. And it's an optimistic thing. Change is always, it's not always pleasant. It's sometimes painful. But change is inevitable, and change brings good things and as well as bad things. And I think we are at an inflection point. And I think it's the move to a new global order is really important and will be of extraordinary benefit if we move to a multipolar world, as is being proposed and as increasing states are moving towards that, where, people, what you say, you speak only for yourself. You don't try and speak for the world. You don't speak for other great powers. You speak for who you are. And also you have sovereignty, and you try and manage your affairs as best you can. I think it'll be a change for the better. I welcome it, and I hope, and I think President Putin has actually done an extraordinary job. I mean, his speech on New Year's Eve was a tremendous speech of rallying people to a new world order. And I think many people, I get the impression, you're in the Middle East, I'm not, but I get the impression that it's almost the sort of an atmosphere of excitement, almost like we saw years ago, after the wars, and then there was going to be the end of colonialism, and there was going to be independence for states. Well, it never happened, but there's some of that coming back. For the first time, states are standing up to the hegemon and saying, I'm sorry, we're not prepared to accept you tell us what to think and how our economy is run. We're going to try and do it our own way and make the best of it. And it's gathering force and it's gathering pace. You've seen Saudi Arabia, Turkey, all these countries. I mean, there's a big rush towards BRICS taking place.
Towards China, towards Russia.
Through China, Russia. And we'll see changes in the trading system. I think we'll move away from the dollar. It won't happen overnight, but it is going to happen.
And you are one of the first few people who talked about this particular issue, Alistair. Iran has instantiated the 7,200 kilometer north-south transport corridor with a 12 million ton shipment of Russian grain via Iran bound for India. Speaking recently, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said, "Rest assured that in the near future we will see a serious drop in the West's ability to steer the global economy the way it pleases. Whether it wants it or not, it will have to sit down and talk." So the region's map is shifting, as we can see, unmistakably eastwards. What are they saying here, Alistair?
What are they saying is that we can move to a system which is quite free from the dollar. There are some pilot experiments. There's a thing called the M-band, where about 5 states are doing peer-to-peer, real-time foreign exchange in a central bank cryptocurrency with blockchain as its backup. And they're doing that with no banks in between whatsoever. They're doing direct exchange between these central banks using a specific cryptocurrency. I'm not sure that this is going to be the answer in the longer term, but all these things are quite exciting. They're changing the whole way we think about economy, the whole way we think about finance, and the whole way we have to think about it. The sooner the dollar goes and we get outside of the dollar sphere, I think it'll be very liberating, and there will be an explosion of sort of entrepreneurship and energy from people, that they are not always worried about sanctions and about the dollar and having to go through dollar banks. It's started. It's not going to happen overnight, but it's very important shift taking place at the moment.
Right. The US-Israeli divide across a range of foreign policy issues already is wide, Alistair, but primordially, the Netanyahu extreme right government, recently sworn in, of course, openly threatens confrontation with the Palestinians and more annexation. Yet we all also are aware of the fact that the Palestinian resistance factions and Hezbollah are on high alert and readiness. What do you read here, Alistair? Quickly, if I may.
Okay, it's very serious and could be even more serious. But basically, Netanyahu, clearly, if he allows his ministers to go down this route of disempowering, dispossessing the Palestinians, he's going to run into a roadblock in Washington. His only answer to this is to scare everyone and shout, Iran, Iran, breakout capacity, someone has to bomb Iran, and to try and persuade the Americans that this is a crisis that needs military remedy to deal with Iran as it increases its enrichment and the type of enrichment.
Right, and is the JCPOA dead, Alistair?
For now, yes. It's dead for now, but you never know. There may be a point in the future when it will, in the struggle between Netanyahu and Biden, who don't like each other, that Biden might want to do one in the eye at Netanyahu by saying, well, I'm going to go back and reopen the negotiations.
And resuscitate it, yes.
Resuscitate it as a means of putting pressure on Netanyahu on his Palestinian issue. And they say, as Netanyahu says, bomb Iran. Biden says, no, I'm talking to Iran. It would really mess up the Netanyahu policy.
Right.
I don't know if it'll happen, but I think it's possible.
We have to wait and see. Thank you for always being there with your sharp perspective and unwavering stances and your fond participation always on Al-Mayadeen and on من الداخل. It has always been a pleasure to have you on the show, Alistair, throughout the last 10 years, and shall always be a pleasure to host you on our forthcoming encounters. Bless you, Alistair Krook, founder and director of Conflicts Forum.
Inshallah, we'll meet in the new format.
Most welcome. وفي الختام دائما الشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة. جزيل الشكر وخالص الامتنان والتقدير لقبطان الميادين الأستاذ غسان من جدو على رعايته وتوجيهاته ودعمه على الدوام وإيمانه بحيثية وأهمية ورقي برنامج من الداخل بكل تفاصيله. عميق الشكر لكل الزملاء والزميلات في الأقسام كافة وفي كل مكاتب الميادين حول العالم لدعمهم ومهنيتهم وإيثارهم وتعاونهم في كل الاتجاهات. وحتى نلتقي من كل فريق عمل من الداخل الذي رافقكم لأكثر من 10 سنوات من كل الميادين، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.